Hello and welcome back to my shop. Thanks for tuning in. In today's exciting episode, we are going to take a look at how this nightstand can keep your family safe. Now, what does that mean? Well, imagine this. You're a responsible gun owner. You want to keep your guns locked up, out of sight, away from kids, but you don't want to have a safe mounted on the wall. Well, let's face it. If you have a safe mounted on the wall and somebody breaks into your house while you're not home, when they see that safe, it's the first thing they're going to take. So we want to keep our guns out of sight, out of mind. We also want to keep them locked up and away from children. So this nightstand has a concealed drawer in it that is lockable, so we can keep the guns out of the hands of your kids, out of the sight of our burglars, but easy to access in the event that you need to protect your home and your family. In today's video, we're going to take a look at how to build this. Full disclosure, as I built this, I didn't have any plans. This was all off the top of my head. So as I went, a few things got changed, and a couple things didn't turn out quite as perfect as I would like them to. But to be fair, this is going into my bedroom, and I can live with some of those imperfections. This was really about making sure that the concealed drawer functioned the way I wanted it to. The joinery I used on this project, I would say, is at like an intermediate level, meaning the structure is not put together with pocket screws, but also the joinery is not overly complicated either. This is all a simple panel construction with mortise and tenon, which is similar to your drawer fronts, which is a mortise and tenon panel construction. The drawer boxes I built were just a simple box joint, and the concealed drawer, oh no. If you want to see the concealed drawer, you're going to have to wait till later. The wood I chose is a solid maple that I picked up at a local Amish mill, except for the large panels. Those are a 3/4 inch maple plywood that I picked up at a local big box store. For the stain color, I did as any intelligent, self-respecting man would do, and I let my wife pick the color. She went with a Minwax gel stain. The color is chestnut. For the top coat, I went with a Gemini satin conversion varnish. This is a spray applied finish that is very durable. So let's go ahead and get right into the build. As I mentioned, I started out with some hard maple that I picked up at a local Amish mill. The first thing I'm going to do is break this down into sizes that are a little closer to what I need. This is going to make the pieces easier to manage, and also there'll be less waste when straightening edges. The boards actually are pretty nice, but I'm going to run them through the planer just to clean up the faces and make sure they're perfect. And also they're a little thick. These actually came at about 15/16, so we're going to bring these down a little bit. Next I'll true up an edge on the joiner. This is where breaking them down into smaller pieces is really helpful. With shorter pieces, you make less passes across the joiner to get a true edge. For the legs on this, I'm going to use 3 pieces glued together to make them all about 2 1/4 inches thick each. So I'll glue up all of them and then clamp them all together all at once. And then just a few more pieces to glue together to make up the top. Once all the glue's dried, I run them through the planer to get them real close to their final thickness, and then I'll run them over to the joiner to true up one of the edges. After you have an edge trued up on the joiner, you can then take it to the table saw and rip it almost to the final width. I want to leave it just a little thick at this point. Then I'll run them through the planer, turning them on each edge so that they are exactly the same dimension in both directions. Then I'll head over to the miter box to square up one end, and then I will use the stop on the fence to cut them all the same length. I'm going to make some marks on the end grain to lay out where my dado cuts need to be for the panels, and then I'm going to number the pieces. This is just going to help me keep things orientated, so hopefully I don't make a mistake later when I'm making the cuts and have to scrap one of these legs. I want to make the bulk of my dado cuts with my table saw. You could do this with a router, but as hard maple is, it's really hard, and that's a lot of work on the router. So I'm going to make the cuts with the table saw first. Here I'm going to take some tape and mark the front and back of my blade so I know exactly where to start and stop my cuts. I marked each board to know exactly where I want my cuts to end, and now I just need to line up those marks on the board with my marks on the table saw. Just be sure to allow the blade to come to a complete stop before you pull your piece out. And for the cuts that are mirrored, rather than resetting my fence, I clamped a block on the near side of my fence so that I can make a plunge cut without worrying about a kickback. This might not be the safest operation, but it's what I did and it worked pretty well. Of course, each of these cuts now have an unfinished cut at the end because of the shape of the saw blade. We're going to finish these up with the router. So just like the table saw, I'm going to mark the front and back of my router bit so I know exactly where to stop when I'm making these cuts. And that leaves me with just a little bit of chisel work to square up the end of those cuts. When I cut all the horizontal rail pieces, I like to stack them up and clamp them together. This way I know that they're going to be all exactly the same length. For cutting all the tenons, I kind of experimented with this vertical jig and also a little cross-cut sled to make horizontal cuts. Let me know in the comments, what do you think? Which way do you prefer? Do you like to cut horizontally or vertically? And of course the dado cut for your panels lines right up with the tongue part of your mortise and tenon. Now I just need to make some layout marks for a couple of mortises I need to cut for the two rails that will span across the front of the cabinet. The bottom rail is just going to line up with the rails that are going to be on the side, and then there'll be one mid rail. I'm going to remove the bulk of the material with the drill press and a Forstner bit. Using a drill press just makes sure my cut is nice and square, and then I will just have a little bit of cleanup left with the chisel when I'm done. I like to clamp a block at the end of my cut. I use this like a guide. It just helps me ensure that my cut at the end is perfectly square and vertical. I'm using 3/4 inch maple plywood for the sides and the back. I'm just going to cut this down with a straight edge and a skill saw. I cut this face down because the direction the blade spins on the skill saw will create a better cut on the underside than it will on the top. I'll take it over on my crosscut sled then to cut these down to the final size, making sure to always remove that factory edge because we just don't know how square that factory edge really is. I'll use my dado stack to cut a rabbet around the perimeter of these panels. This is going to allow the panel to sit in the dados that we cut earlier, and when making these cuts, the panels need to be cut a little bit loose. There needs to be room for expansion and contraction. The panels really should free float inside those cuts. Before I start assembling anything, I like to sand my panels down, and actually I'm going to completely stain them before I put it together. This is going to allow me to get the stain all the way to the edges so that even when there's some expansion and contraction happening, I won't have any raw wood showing. I'm going to round over the bottom corners of the legs. This way, if it needs to be slid around on the carpet, it doesn't snag. I'll also use an 1/8 inch roundover bit on the edges to ease the corners. And all my pieces will be sanded before I assemble. It is much easier to do the sanding now than it is to do after it's assembled. If you were to compare sanding maple to, let's say, red oak, maple is much harder, it takes much longer to sand, and the grain does not hide the swirl marks. If you don't sand thoroughly, you will see all the swirl marks once you stain. When I'm sanding hard maple, I start at 80 grit and I go up to 220 grit. You have to hit all the grits, don't skip any. And when you think you've sanded enough, chances are you should double it. I'm using a Minwax gel stain, which applies pretty much the way any other stain does. It's just a little thicker and doesn't absorb quite as fast. So I use a rag to rub it in really well and then just take a dry rag and wipe it off. I'm also going to stain against any of these inside edges that join the panels. This way I don't have to worry about touching the panels later and getting any excess stain on them. I just find this to be an easier way to do it. Something I like to do before my glue ups is wrap all my joints with tape. I find this makes cleanup much easier, and also I don't have to worry about any of the glue soaking into the wood and causing flaws in my finish later. It's important when you're putting together any kind of panel construction, you have to keep it all square. For me, I just use some stops against the dogs in my workbench. If you don't have this, you can pull diagonals or just use a large square. You just don't want anything to get crooked as you're clamping it up. And you'll notice I'm only gluing together the rails and stiles. I'm not applying any glue to the panel or in the dado where the panel is going to be resting. We want to do our best to make sure that that panel is allowed to free float so it allows for expansion and contraction. After the two side panels are dried, now it's time to assemble the entire cabinet. Just like before, I want to keep everything square, so I'm using the stops in my bench dogs. And just like before, I am only gluing the stiles and rails. The panels need to free float. The next thing I work on is my drawer boxes. For this I'm using aspen pine, and clamping a stop on the fence ensures that I can make repeatable cuts. I'm going to use a box joint jig for creating these drawer boxes. This is actually a very easy way to make a box. They're very strong, and honestly I think they're nice looking. I just made a video on how to make this jig. If you haven't seen that video, go ahead and check that out. I'll leave a link in the description below. I'm going to use my table saw again to cut out the dados for the bottoms of the drawers. You could probably do this with a router, being that I'm only using aspen pine, but I like to do the bulk of the work with the table saw first. And you don't want those dados to run all the way through the pieces, or you'll have some ugly corners. So I need to mark the front and back of the blade against the fence. Now I can use those reference lines to plunge into these dado cuts, and I will start and stop just before I get through the ends. And of course, because of the shape of the saw blade, the ends need to be cleaned up just a little bit. This is a quick setup with the router. I clamp a couple blocks to the fence, and just a quick touch up on each end. For the drawer bottoms, I'm using the same 3/4 inch maple plywood for no reason other than I've already bought this plywood, so I'm going to use it. Cutting these panels out is going to look exactly like cutting out the panels for the sides and the back of the cabinet, so we're going to buzz through this real quickly. If you've ever tried to sand the inside of a drawer box, you'll know what a pain it is. It's much easier to sand the inside of all these panels before you put it together, which of course includes the drawer bottoms. Taping these joints is especially helpful when you're making a drawer box. Glue is going to ooze out everywhere, and those inside corners can be very hard to clean. Wrapping these joints with tape is going to cut your cleanup time drastically. If you've never tried this, give it a try. You'll never stop doing it. I'll even add a small square of tape at each corner of the bottom panel so that I don't have any glue soaking into the panel. And just to be on the safe side, before I glue everything up, I'm going to dry fit this just to make sure everything's right. Gluing these together is going to be very similar to gluing up the panels in that we are only gluing the corners up. The bottom panel has to free float. And again, I'm going to use the dogs on my bench to help me keep everything squared up. I'll then take a rag and wipe up the glue that oozed on those inside corners, but because I applied the tape, I don't have to worry about any of that glue having soaked into the wood. And then I find it's best to remove the tape before the glue dries. The inside of these drawer boxes are all sanded already, but now that the glue is dried, I have to sand the outsides. Luckily, this pine is going to sand much faster than the maple, and this 3M sander, well, I'm not going to say it makes it enjoyable, but it is a lot less miserable than any other sander I've used. If you've never tried one of these 3M sanders, they are amazing. I'm not going to lie, the price of this sander is a lot more than you pay at a big box store for the big box sanders. But the difference in performance and comfort is astonishing. As I say this, I know I'm starting to sound a bit like a fanboy. To be clear, I am not sponsored by 3M or anyone else for that matter. But if you are interested in purchasing a sander like this, I'll leave a link in the description below to the sander I purchased from Amazon. If you do use that link, the billionaires at Amazon are going to give me a little commission, so I would appreciate if you'd use the link if you're going to buy one of these sanders. For the drawer fronts, we're going to do a mission style drawer, and these are going to look just like the cuts we've already been making, more dados and more tenons. For the panel portions of the drawer fronts, I wanted to use solid maple so that the color match would be perfect. So I'm taking some boards and planing them down to about a 1/2 inch thick. And then back to the table saw to rip them down, and I'll use my crosscut sled to cut them to length. And these will get a rabbet cut around the perimeter, just like everything else. And just like everything else, the panels and the inside edges will get stained before I assemble. And the assembly for these is going to be just like everything else. I'm going to tape all the inside corners, we're going to glue just the mortise and tenons, and the panel is going to free float. After the glue dries, I use an 1/8 inch roundover bit to ease all the edges. And then just some final sanding. Again, like I said before, it's hard maple and it sands really hard. Take your time, go through all the grits, and when you think you're done, keep going. Unfortunately, I don't have a planer or drum sander large enough to do this entire top. In hindsight, I probably should have ripped this in half, ran the 2 halves through the planer, and then just had one seam to sand. But I did this all with the belt sander, and it actually turned out really nice. And then I just need some final sanding on the cabinet, and I'll be ready for stain. Staining the rest of this is going to be just like staining everything else. I think we've covered that pretty good. So I'm going to buzz through that real fast. So now I'll be getting ready to apply the finish. I'll be using this satin conversion varnish. This one's made by Gemini. I picked this up at my local accent paint hardware store. It requires a catalyst, which is 4 ounces to a gallon. I don't want to use all of this, so I'm going to break it down to a quart to 1 ounce. I apply this with a cheap sprayer I buy from Harbor Freight. It works great. I run it at about 60 psi. An absolute must when you're applying conversion varnish is going to be a respirator. The fumes are very harsh. For the cleanup, I'll be using acetone. And before taking a quart out of this can, you need to mix the can thoroughly. There are solids in there which determine the finish, whether it's a satin or a flat or a high gloss. The flatter the finish, the more solids that are in there. And if you don't mix all the solids before you separate it, this finish might be different than the next finish. And like I said before, I'm going to break this down to 1 quart of the finish, which will require 1 ounce of accelerator. 1 ounce is the same as 2 tablespoons. And it is best when you steal the tablespoon out of your wife's kitchen, don't let her see you. And it is best to use a strainer when you're filling your spray gun. I get everything set up in my homemade spray booth. This thing actually works really well. I did touch a little bit more on the setup of this in my previous table build video. If you'd like to see that, I'll leave a link in the description below. I like this conversion varnish for a couple of reasons. One is that it is very fast drying. This is ready to sand in about 30 minutes. Less open time with the air means less dust settling on your project, meaning you have a better finish. It also has a lot of solids. It's a high build product, meaning every time you spray a coat of conversion varnish, it's like spraying multiple coats of polyurethane. In between coats, I sand lightly with 320 grit sandpaper. Doing this is going to make your final coat smooth as glass. With this conversion varnish being such a high build product, you really can do just 2 coats and it's perfectly fine. I happen to do 3 coats on this project because the product I had mixed up was enough to do 3 coats. And once you've mixed that accelerator, the pot life is only a couple of days. So I figured rather than wasting the material, I'll just do another coat. The one place I will be using pocket holes is the supports for the drawer slides. I have this jig that I bought a few years ago, and I don't use pocket holes enough that I mounted this in a bench or anything yet, but I do really like this jig. It's, I believe, made by Mosca. I might be pronouncing that wrong. I'll leave a link in the description below if you want to check it out. But I really like this jig. It's all aluminum, so it's very solid, and the vacuum port really clears the chippings nicely. One support's going to be attached all the way to the top. This is for that concealed drawer. Then there will be a middle drawer and a bottom drawer. The middle and bottom drawers, I make my supports the exact same width as the drawer slide, and then I can install them using these scrap pieces that I cut to a predetermined length. This is going to put my drawer slides exactly where I need them, and it will be repeatable for the other side. To install the slides, you just need to separate the 2 halves. This gives you access to the holes, so you can pre-drill and screw them in. The top drawer slide can't be installed until after I put the top on, but I'm going to pre-drill the holes now just to make it easier later. I'm clamping this piece of 3/4 inch to the face because this drawer slide needs to set back 3/4 of an inch. The concealed drawer I built is only 10 inches, but the slides are 12 inches. This is going to allow the drawer to open fully past the top, even with the overhang. To attach the top, I start with clamping a couple of blocks to the front. These are just going to help me keep it aligned as I attach from the underside with a couple of pocket screws that I pre-drilled in those supports for the drawer guides. Now I can install the drawer guides for the concealed drawer. The placement of the drawer guides in the cabinet is set up so that I can use a piece of 3/4 inch plywood and attach my drawer slide to the side of my drawer boxes. Now I can start installing my drawer fronts. Starting with the concealed drawer, I'm going to use double-sided tape to temporarily hold the drawer front in place, and then I will screw that in. For the main drawer faces, I'm going to lay out and drill the holes for the handles right away, and then I'll be able to utilize those holes when attaching the faces to the drawer box. I ripped a couple pieces of scrap that I'll clamp to the face of the cabinet. These are going to help me keep my drawer fronts perfectly in line with each other and perfectly centered on the cabinet. I'll use the double-sided tape just like I did previously, and then I'll drill through the holes I just made for the handle, and then the handle will be used to temporarily hold the face on until I can permanently attach with screws. So now we've got a working cabinet and a working concealed drawer. Now we just need to figure out a locking mechanism, and I got an idea for that. I picked up this RFID lock that I'm going to use to lock that concealed drawer. Pretty inexpensive. I ordered this off of Amazon. Comes with a couple of cards and a couple tags. The way this works, one side's going to attach to the cabinet, the other side to the drawer, locks it together, and even through 3/4 inch material, it's going to unlock. Powered by 4 AAA batteries. It also comes with this cord so we can plug it into a USB. If you need to order one for yourself, I'll leave a link in the description below. Now let's get that installed. Unfortunately, this does mean I have to drill a hole through my brand new cabinet. Of course, this hole will be on the back side. Nobody will ever actually see it. I'll drill all the way through with a small bit, and then I'll drill from each side with the full-size bit. This way I don't have any tear out on the inside or outside. You can place yours wherever you like. I'm setting mine just slightly off center. My idea is I'm going to have my RFID card taped to the bottom side of a lamp. The lamp will be sitting in the center of the cabinet, and if I ever need it, I can just slide the lamp over a little bit off center and the door will unlock. Now I'll flip the cabinet over. It'll make it easier for me to install this lock. I'm going to need to set the lock in place. I'll actually have to set the latch in also with the drawer in so I can spot exactly where that lock needs to sit. It's actually pretty tight, but there is a little bit of room for error. It's a little tight getting in here with both the camera and myself to get this attached, but I think you can see what's going on here. I'm just pre-drilling the holes. I'm going to add a couple screws. Now I will be able to take that double-sided tape and stick it to the back of this latch. I will stick the latch into the locking mechanism and then close the drawer, and that will stick it exactly where it needs to be, and then just add a couple of screws. At this point I'm just reaching in there and setting that latch in place, and then I'll close the drawer onto it, and I'll reach in and hold onto it while I unlock the RFID with my card on top. Then I'll just permanently install with a couple of screws. Now it's all ready to go back together for its final assembly. I am going to say this one disclaimer. This latch is not bulletproof. It's not super strong. You need to be responsible for knowing whether or not this latch is good enough to keep your kids out of that drawer. Some kids are more inquisitive than others, and this might be okay for some houses, and it might not be for others. And that's all I have for you today. Thanks for tuning in. I really appreciate you watching till the end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video and hopefully I earned your subscription. If you could, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, leave me some comments and let me know what you think of this project, and stay tuned for the next one.